Good morning, second grade. I hope you guys all had an awesome weekend and you got to get outside and enjoy some of that beautiful weather. Since today is Tuesday, I wanted to continue reading with our I Survived chapter book. A couple of announcements first. I wanted to remind you that our Zoom meeting on Friday is going to have our talent show. So you get to pick any talent that you can showcase to your classmates and to me. And we also have our free write, where you get to write about anything that you want to write about as long as it's appropriate for school, and also share that on Friday Zoom meeting. So it's going to be a ton of fun and don't miss it. All right, so far in our reading, George and Aunt Daisy are looking for Phoebe. Phoebe must have been looking for George because she left. She was not there when Henry told everyone to get to the top deck because the ship had hit an iceberg. Luckily, Phoebe left a trail of candies all the way down to the lower deck, which Aunt Daisy and George followed. When they got to the lower deck, they were locked in and they noticed water rising from the lower deck. Then, luckily, they ran into Enzo and Marco, the Italian friends that George met before. So let's continue reading and see what happens. Chapter 11. Unsinkable, unsinkable. George whispered those words like a prayer, over and over in his mind. He thought of Mr. Andrews, of how sure he was of the ship. But the longer he stared at that water, the foaming green water, rising higher every second, the more certain he became. The Titanic was in trouble. "We must go up," Marco said to Aunt Daisy. "We find a way." But she shook her head, holding up Phoebe's bright blue coat and her life jacket. "My niece, Phoebe," Aunt Daisy said. "She's down here." George could see she was fighting back tears. George had never seen her look so sad and helpless, not even when Uncle Cliff died. "She came down here looking for me," George said. "We can't find her." Marco's amber eyes became very intent. "An idea," he said. He knelt down and spoke to Enzo in Italian. The boy smiled and nodded. Then Marco hoisted the little boy up onto his shoulders. Enzo took a huge breath and screamed, "Phoebe! Phoebe!" People stopped talking and stared up at the boy with the foghorn voice. "Phoebe! Phoebe!" As a hush fell over the crowd, George heard a faint voice. "I'm here! I'm here!" The crowd parted, and Phoebe appeared, her spectacles crooked, her face pale. She staggered forward and threw her arms around George, burying her face in his chest. "I found you," she whispered. George didn't bother arguing over who did the finding. And anyway, his words were stuck in his throat, so he just held her tight. It took some time for Phoebe to calm down enough to tell her story. That yes, she had been looking for George and heading for the baggage hold. That she got caught in the crowd of people rushing toward the back of the ship. "It was like a stampede," she said. As Phoebe talked, Aunt Daisy helped her into her coat and life jacket. Enzo held Phoebe's hands like they were old friends. And the strange thing was that it felt that way, like they'd known Marco and Enzo forever. Maybe that's what happened when you got trapped in a flooding ship together. George started to feel calmer with Phoebe close to him. But then came a deep booming sound, a kind of groaning that echoed up all around them. At first, George thought that maybe the engines had started up again. But no, this wasn't the sound of the Titanic's mighty engines. The entire ship catapulted forward. People fell, toppling like dominoes. George was thrown into the wall. Screams and shouts echoed through the hallway. He managed to grab Enzo by the life jacket as he went sailing by him. Enzo just giggled as he fell into George's lap. To him, this was a fun game. George hoped he never figured out that it wasn't. "What was that?" Phoebe gasped, digging her fingers into George's arms. Nobody answered, but they all knew. The Titanic was sinking. "We will go up," Marco said. "How?" Aunt Daisy said. Phoebe grabbed George's hand. "You, Georgie," she said. "What?" George said. "Phoebe's right," Aunt Daisy said. "You know the ship better than anyone." She turned to Marco. "He's explored every inch." George couldn't believe it. They were counting on him? But what if he made a mistake? What if they all got lost? "You can do it," Phoebe whispered. And so George closed his eyes, picturing Mr. Andrews' blueprints in his mind. And he remembered the escape ladders. He remembered what Mr. Andrews had told him. The ladders are in the stoker's quarters, and they run up 3 decks. He pointed toward the front of the ship. "This way," he said. Chapter 12. There was no crowd here, just abandoned trunks and suitcases. And water. It was seeping into the hallway from under the doors of some of the cabins. No wonder those people were trying to push their way upstairs. They'd probably known right away that the ship was in trouble, and the bottom decks were flooding. The door to the stoker's quarters was locked. Marco handed Enzo over to George and rammed the door with his shoulder, breaking the lock. George rushed inside and went to the back wall. And there it was, a ladder bolted to the wall, just like Mr. Andrews said it would be. It came through the floor and shot straight up through an opening in the ceiling. George almost laughed with relief. "Bravo, George," Marco said. "Bravo, Giorgio," Enzo said, clapping. George hopped onto the ladder, with Phoebe and Aunt Daisy at his heels. George was worried about Enzo, but the little guy scrambled like a monkey right ahead of Marco. They came up in a small dining room meant for crew members. And then George led everyone down a long second-class corridor, up the grand staircase, and finally out onto the crowded boat deck. They'd made it. An officer came hurrying over to Aunt Daisy. "Madam, there is a lifeboat about to leave. You and the children must come at once." The man looked at Marco. "Women and children only, sir," he said somberly. "I'm afraid you will have to stay with the other gentlemen." Marco nodded. "Yes," he said, "I know." Phoebe had been right. There were not enough lifeboats. Not nearly enough. What would happen to all of these men on the deck? There were hundreds of them. And what about the crew and those people on G deck? George's heart was pounding so hard he thought it would break through his chest. He felt dizzy and sick. Marco got down on his knees and spoke very quietly to Enzo. Enzo nodded. Marco kissed him on the forehead, and then Enzo ran over to Aunt Daisy. She picked him up. "I say he will go on a special boat ride," Marco said. "I say you will not leave him." Aunt Daisy nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I promise you that." Marco and Aunt Daisy looked at each other. Neither of them said a word, but a whole conversation seemed to happen with their eyes. Phoebe was really crying now, looking away so Enzo wouldn't see. George felt like someone was choking him. "Come on now," the officer screamed. And so they left Marco. And when George turned around, just a few seconds later, he was gone. The officer led them through a crowd of men to the side of the ship, where a lifeboat hung just over the side. It was packed with people, all women and children except for 2 sailors who stood at either end. An officer helped Phoebe over the rail, and then one of the sailors reached over and pulled her into the boat. George helped Enzo, who tumbled in next to Phoebe. Aunt Daisy had a hard time climbing over in her skirts, but George held her hand, and she finally made it. Now it was George's turn. He took a step over the railing. Someone pulled him back roughly. "No more room," the officer said. "Women and children only." "Lower away," he called. "No," called Aunt Daisy, standing up in the boat. "He's only 10 years old. Wait." The lifeboat rocked and almost tipped over. Ladies shrieked. "You will drown us all," a woman shouted. "Sit down, or I'll throw you over," the sailor said. And now Phoebe was screaming too. Enzo howled. George was too shocked to move. Phoebe leaped up and grabbed a hold of one of the ropes. She was trying to climb out of the lifeboat back to George. He gasped as her hand slipped and she dangled over the sea. A sailor grabbed her around the waist and threw her into the boat. And then the boat slid down on its ropes and splashed into the water. Aunt Daisy and Phoebe were shouting up at him as the sailors rowed the boat away. George stood there at the rail, watching, his entire body shaking. He stood there for what felt like a lifetime after their boat disappeared into the darkness. He couldn't look down at the water, so he stared up at the sky, at all of those stars. He closed his eyes and told himself it was a nightmare. He was really asleep in his suite. Or no, he was at home on the farm in his bed, with Phoebe sleeping across the room and Papa sitting by the fire downstairs. He closed his eyes tighter. He tried to block out the terrible noises around him. He felt himself tipping to the side, and he held tighter to the rail. And then he couldn't hold on anymore. His hand slipped, and George fell, smashing his head on the deck. And then there was silence. All right, we will continue reading with chapter 13 and see what happens next week. Thank you guys. I can't wait to see you on Friday.